welcome to TradeTneMBI.com and our ongoing series on the D Omega. And again, we're looking at the full D Omega right here, but today we're going to focus on a little more advanced features. We previously discussed the steel and the green in the form of pivots. Today we're going to add an additional line to that, and the easiest way to focus on just the three of those would be the steel, green, and this will be the cyan we'll be looking at. So we right click, format, and we go up and we're going to just turn off the red and the white for now, because we can go ahead and get ourselves a little bit more detail in seeing the interrelationship between these as we start to progress. So we're going to go off of where we had here original buy signal, which came off higher pivots, and that's fine. But then what happens is we move into a particularly interesting point here at the square, where we start now to have our other high pivot. Fine, that's a continuation off of this previous one, no problem with that. But where it becomes interesting is we then develop the green moving above the steel, and it's already above the cyan. That's an indication of a strong trend, and so we typically want to see either the steel on top or the green on top of cyan if we want to look for a maintaining of positive momentum to the upside. So then all of a sudden we're in the middle of this uptrend, and in number one we get a declining steel pivot. Oh no, shocking. Yes, absolutely. You'd be terrified at this point. You'd want to move your stops up and be prepared for an impending turnaround. Not so fast. We have green, which has superseded the steel and therefore taking over the supremacy of that up momentum. And as long as it's maintaining itself above the cyan as well, you're okay. Does it mean that you still wouldn't adjust your stop? More likely, yes, you'd be still right here about the magenta level from the ABM, which is our trend level of adjustable stops that we can then incorporate based on where our reading's at and how comfortable we are with that trade. So from there, we would continue and say, fine, all we have is just an up pivot from the green, which is correspondingly right here, transferring all the way up to where the gray box is. So that bodes well for continuation at this particular point. So we'll go ahead and slide forward, and then what we see is, well, an even higher pivot on the green. That's positive as well. And we're looking at cyan. We really don't have much happening with the cyan at this particular point. It's just maintaining itself kind of flat, and you can see this continual deterioration though of the steel, but it's now moved into what we refer to as a safety zone, and the polarity of that having the green up so high means that you've reached a level where the green might be referred to as overbought, but can still continue in that, and that's where the ABM becomes very important in following that. But as we start to move forward in here, we're going to look and see that we start to make a lower pivot with the green. And now we're in a situation where, okay, now we've made lower pivot at this particular point. And important now, from where our cyan was, we're now both have cleared it. If we were talking about right here, just from a pivot standpoint, it's now moved above. But now we're actually creating our first pivot right here of the cyan. And within another bar, we get our complete lower pivot of the green, and subsequently right after that we end up with a lower pivot on the cyan again. So now you have completion of a lower pivot here for the cyan, coming off of the higher, kind of a mixed bag at that particular point. And so while you would be concerned because you're getting lower pivots from the green, you're still below on your steel here, and you've kind of sandwiched the cyan. So while you would probably want to be moving up into your higher level stops, in a way the ABM is doing it for you, because you can see that the lines are starting to condense. Where there was separation, they've now coalesced into a tighter formation, anticipating weakness moving forward with this, particularly since now we have a series of consecutive lower moves. And then you can see that the steel is about to make an additional lower pivot, and then we get an important movement right here. Well, one, we move into a red zone of dipping below our stop level for the ABM, but coincidentally, we also have the crossing of the cyan above the green indicating that our trend has now been superseded by the short side. Still in a negative situation vis-a-vis the steel. Obviously, it's well below, so we're still going to be looking at the pivots from the green because it's on top. And now you can also see that if we were to continue our line here, even from the most recent pivot, by sliding this forward, we've exceeded where that high pivot was. Which, if I can get that to go just a fraction to make it straight, but we get the point, it's still, whoops, that would have been a couple too far. Once you get the hang of those, it starts to get better. And then likewise, we had even from the dip here, once it crossed above there. So it all happened at the exact same time, giving you your clear signal to be looking for a negative move. Okay, so as we move forward here, we can see in number 3, we're looking at continual rising pivots here from the cyan. What I like to do in these particular cases too, though, is when you continue to make higher and higher moves, and this really isn't as much a pivot because it's so flat, but I always get a little more cautious when I set the low side pivot here and look for any dips because that could represent some positive activity. The difference in this particular case is a continued cascade of the green lower, and for the first time though, we're getting steel moving higher, so the potential for a little bit of upside action exists at this particular point. And here we go now. We've got steel that moves above and cyan moving below, as well as the green moving above steel. So now we've reached a point where, okay, what I'm looking for though would be a higher pivot from the green. We start to see it here with the cyan, so that's looking very positive. But immediately we form a spider at that particular point. And it's a little bit tougher because we didn't get any pivot relationship from the green that we could utilize other than the last pivot, which was all the way up here. And so you had still a continuation of that moving lower, as well as you moved yourself out of the safety zone with the steel. So that steel coming up had just moved yourself out of the safety zone, which is down here below that -7, indicating that what we thought could be a decent turnaround point. A little bit more troubling at this particular spot. Following that ABM going across, now we're making a lower cyan pivot, which should suggest some bullishness, except for the fact that we're looking at a situation where we have lower still pivots on the green. We're now well below with both the cyan, the steel and the green are below cyan. So shorts still in the overriding capacity here, taking along at this particular point, I think is suspect and one where you would want to be very careful about as we see the yellow candle approach with what would be your higher pivot here, but you're clearly getting a lower pivot developing on your green with your cyan on top. This is where you can then begin to move your magenta line over here and be looking. What I would be looking for is, does my cyan dip below this low pivot at this particular point, indicating that it's going to fall down further. Next couple of bars are really going to tell and whether or not we can get a positive pivot from either the steel or from the green. And if you were looking at this particular point, you'd have to be a little bit concerned from a long standpoint still, because there's nothing that's turned around. We still haven't broken above. The potential is though that steel is moving higher here, so it could break above that, but we didn't get the dip of cyan below our magenta. In fact, cyan now has turned higher. At the same point, we got a green at this particular spot. Now the ABM that we see up here develops, it places a stop point above here from your short setup, which would be a little bit better than break even at this particular point, and you don't have convincing evidence that you're going to have a topside move at this particular point, because you haven't created a lower pivot from your cyan that suggests that you're going to get overriding with the steel. Now that it's finally moved above, you would have expected to see steel, cyan dip below the magenta down here. But now you formed another lower pivot, so you can bring that up like that. And the key here will be, okay, does the cyan move higher than this previous pivot? And easy to find out what that value is. You just click directly over it and your info window comes up there. We're looking for a number of 4.95 on the move. And in this particular case, it does even go higher. We've now moved up to 6.4 down at the bottom corner right there, which makes that a higher pivot. We've also now regained short supremacy with the steel dipping lower. So our expectation would be that this was going to continue to move lower. Now, if I were long, we would have already been stopped up because the ABM recognized this and moved the stop way up, mitigating any downside for anyone who wanted to take a long setup at this particular point. Hoping to capture some of that steel moving higher. Clearly, we never got any improvement from the green, and its lower pivots only suggested that this little pop was an opportunity to get free of the situation until it clarified, but it was still looking more short. And then let's see how bad the short gets. And then boom, finally you get steel turning around here. So this is where we would begin to say, okay, time again to start looking for potential upsides. So I would slide my little magenta line right across here just to see if we break down lower with the cyan, giving me an indication that bears have in fact begun to flee the situation. Not yet, though we are starting to make higher steel. The problem is you're making higher steel, but they're not pivots. Nothing has formed the V shape coming up where you also have at least a half point move on the return side from that. But you can see green having moved all the way to the, well, a near bottom. There is no actual bottom to the readings potential, but at a point where it should begin to start to turn up for a pivot move. And as we come here, you can see that the ABM recognizes the positive aspect of that, and its ABM stop dip below. At the same time that you end up with a positive yellow candle as it moves higher, even though you still have not created a pivot, but now you're above that 13.5 range, which tends to lead to a divergence. Any lower pivot from the steel at this particular point, particularly if green or steel stays above the cyan, would be very bullish, and you would expect a decent pop from this kind of a move. And it results in that. And then you can continue to go over it. Now you can see you've made lower pivots here. Should continue with the bullish move as your steel. If we take this going across, cyan is making lower pivots, as we can see right there. We also now finally have green forming pivots, and price responding accordingly, and the ABM having approached and moved up can continue that. There's your first lower pivot on the divergence, where we talked about this on the previous video, and this gives you a little bit better understanding of the D omega and situations like this, where we've often looked at the crossover of the steel moving back above as the potential for your early bearish. This just adds a little bit more context to it and gives us an idea of how we can see the supremacy of a move overall. And that divergence staying on top of the cyan at this particular point, very positive. And we've not yet made a higher pivot. Up there it comes. And you can see then that we've now turned the pivot all the way up here from the lower one, and that should begin your downdrift. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how we can really delve into the depth of the market. We haven't even explored the red and white relationship to all of these, but needless to say, it becomes quantifiable, and the assistance that we gain from our ABM, which incorporates these values to allow us to follow moves at least the best possible. We can't predict how long a trend will be or whether there will be a turn, but we can see it as it's developing, and that is ultimately the most important part of it. As always, continue to trade well.